For nearly 400 years, people treated Solomon's temple as untouchable. They believed God would never let it be burned, but they were wrong. In 586 BC, the temple was set on fire on purpose, and Jerusalem watched its centre collapse. This was not a sudden raid in the night. It was the end of a chain of decisions, and one of those decisions was made by a king who wasn't really free. His name was Zedekiah. He sat on the throne in Jerusalem, but Babylon owned the leash. And when he tried to cut that leash, Babylon sent an army, not a message, and that army came with a strategy built to starve the city into surrender. To understand how the temple ended in flames, you have to go back about 10 years to the moment Zedekiah made the move that locked the city into a siege it could not survive. Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon's emperor, had put him there to keep the area calm and to send heavy payments of silver and gold every year, so the city could keep standing. Inside the palace, though, a group pushed Zedekiah toward a gamble. They said Babylon was overextended and ready to break. They pointed south to Egypt and promised a military partnership, and the pitch was simple. Stop paying Babylon, join the pharaohs, and Judah gets its freedom back. Zedekiah brushed aside the more careful voices around him, and even Jeremiah, who warned that Egypt could not be trusted, and he made the move that locked the city's future in place. The tribute stopped, Babylon's diplomats were driven out, and in real terms that was a declaration of war. Nebuchadnezzar did not answer with letters or negotiations. He called up the full imperial force, not a small punishment unit, but an army meant to wipe stubborn cities off the map. So, when the watchmen looked north, they did not see envoys. They saw dust rising from thousands of troops, horses and siege machines closing in. Zedekiah's bet had failed, and the cost was going to be paid in blood. Yet when Babylon finally reached Jerusalem's gates, the attack everyone expected did not happen. Instead of rushing the walls with arrows and ladders like a movie scene, Nebuchadnezzar chose the slower method, because Jerusalem sat high and was wrapped in steep valleys, and trying to climb up under fire would have killed his own men. So in 588 BC, the Babylonians sealed the city from the outside, building an encircling barrier that turned Jerusalem into a locked pen. No one leaves, and more importantly, nothing to eat gets in. The sword was not the main weapon at first, hunger was. Early on, people still had stores and water in cisterns, and the walls gave them a false feeling of safety, but time kept moving, and the siege did not end quickly. This squeeze lasted 30 months, 2.5 years with the enemy camped outside, cooking, drilling, and waiting for the city to run out of life. Trade routes that carried grain from the countryside were cut, messages to outside allies were stopped, and Jerusalem became a lone pocket, surrounded by enemy camps. Day after day, bread became rarer, the price climbed, and hope dropped. The plan was simple: drain the defenders until they were too weak to lift a shield when the real push finally came. And when the last sacks were sold and the storehouses emptied, the breakdown inside the walls became worse than the threat outside. What started as war beyond the gates turned into something darker in the homes, a collapse that spread through the city without armour or blades. Money stopped meaning what it used to mean. Silver and gold in the palace could not feed anyone, and inflation went wild. A piece of mouldy bread could cost more than whole properties. The people who had urged rebellion, men who once wore fine linen and ate in comfort, ended up wandering the alleys with darkened skin pulled tight over bone, dried out like old timber. Rich and poor blurred into the same misery, until it felt like there were only two groups left: the ones already dead and the ones waiting. Even the water failed, cisterns dropped into mud, and sickness spread fast in that trapped heat. But extreme hunger does something worse than kill the body. Hunger flips the moral switch off. In the Book of Lamentations, you can hear what that kind of hunger does to a city when the usual rules stop holding people in place. Mothers, the very women described as compassionate, reached a point where their minds broke. There was nothing left to hand out. There was nothing left to trade. And in that starvation, they cooked their own children just to survive one more day. While that was happening behind the walls, the work outside the walls kept moving toward its end. Babylon's engineers had been waiting for their moment. They stopped waiting. They found the weak spot in the stone they needed. It happened at night. The sound that cut through the dark was not shouting or trumpets. It was the hard grind of stone being crushed. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the north wall finally failed. A gap opened, and once that opening existed, the fight did not look like some grand last stand. It turned into a rush through the breach. The streets tightened with fear. Torches started showing what was happening, civilians being killed, as panic spread through the lanes. In the middle of that chaos, Zedekiah made his final decision. He did not stay for his throne, he did not stay for the temple, he did not stay for the people. He believed that if Babylon caught him inside the city, it would end immediately with his head. So he chose the dark. He left with his top officers. They used a hidden way out near the king's garden. They moved through the space between the two defensive walls. Then they slipped out toward the wilderness. The escape had a direction and a goal. They aimed for the plains of Jericho. If they could reach the Jordan, they might cross it. The plan was to vanish into the eastern desert, but the reality was simple. They were on foot, and they were already weak and frightened, and they were trying to outrun the best-fed cavalry of the age. Babylonian scouts did not take long to find them. They spotted the group in open country. There was no cover. There was no place to disappear. Once the horsemen closed in, the scene fell apart fast. The guards who had sworn to protect Zedekiah did not hold their ground. They scattered, they ran, and they left the king alone in the dust. Zedekiah was captured alive. He was put in chains. And instead of being dragged back to Jerusalem, he was taken north to Riblah, a military camp in the territory of Hamath. Nebuchadnezzar was there, waiting in person. Zedekiah probably expected the usual ending for a rebel king, a quick execution, or at best prison cell. But Nebuchadnezzar did not want a simple death. He wanted a punishment that would keep working after the battle was over. Zedekiah's sons were brought in. They were young princes. They were the future of the royal line, and in front of their father, who could not move because of bronze restraints, they were executed one by one. When the last one fell, the next step came immediately. The executioners moved in on the king. They did not kill him, they blinded him. The point was clear. The last image Zedekiah would ever see was the death of his sons, and then he would live in darkness with that memory. He was kept alive as a trophy. He was taken to Babylon, and years later he died in prison, still carrying that single picture in his mind. But the royal family was not the only target. The Babylonian plan demanded that Jerusalem be left without leadership, so it could not rise again. Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried out that next step with speed. He seized Sariah, the high priest. He seized Zephaniah, the second-ranking priest. He also took the advisors and the military officers who were still alive. They were not sent into exile. They were taken to Riblah, and there they were executed on the spot. In one sweep, the leaders who held the nation together were cut down. If you believe God's justice still rules over the fate of nations, comment it now. God is just. With the king blinded and the priests dead, the city had no head. It had no government. It had no defence. Jerusalem was left open and exposed. In that empty moment, Nebuzaradan received the next command. Winning the city was not enough. Jerusalem had to be wiped as a power centre, and even though the city had been taken and the temple was still standing, it remained strangely intact for 30 days, not because anyone was showing mercy, but because the next stage had to be organised. Nebuzaradan had not come to settle in. He had come to carry out a sentence, and he would not do it with swords. The temple had already been entered. Soldiers were already walking through its courtyards, yet the building was still standing. The reason for the delay became clear on the 7th day of the month of Av, when Nebuzaradan, the chief of Babylon's imperial guard, arrived with a specific task. The war was finished, and he had come to execute the city. Nebuchadnezzar's order was direct. Jerusalem was not just to be beaten, it was to stop existing as a place that could rise again. And Nebuzaradan approached the destruction like careful dismantling, aiming first at the symbols of authority, not the poor men's shacks, which were barely worth the effort. Nebuzaradan went after the parts of Jerusalem that carried power. The royal palace was on the list. The large homes of the officials who had supported the revolt were on the list. And above everything else, the temple, the house of God, was a target. Inside the sanctuary, the support beams were cedar brought from Lebanon. That wood was old. It had been dried out by centuries of heat and sealed with varnish. So when torches were thrown in, the building did not just catch and spread, the structure flared up hard and fast. The heat did not only stain the limestone used in that region, it split the stone and made it break from the shock. Even the gold inside the Holy of Holies could not hold its shape. The lining melted and slid into the cracks of the floor, mixing into the wreckage as it cooled. The fire was so massive that later records do not line up on a single day. In the Book of Kings, the start is placed on the 7th day. Jeremiah gives the 10th day. Rabbinic tradition set the main mourning on the 9th. The simplest reason for the difference is that the burning stretched over more than one day. It began in the afternoon, pushed through the night, and kept eating the site until Mount Moriah was left with nothing but a dark, smoking mark. In that same week, the people watched something they thought could never happen. The idea that God would never let his house be touched went up in the same smoke. God allowed it. When the flames dropped and the air started to clear, the next stage began. The Babylonian army wanted what still had value. The Babylonian army also wanted the people who were still strong enough to work. So the coming disaster was not only death, it was a long march in chains toward the east that would reshape world history. Inside Jerusalem, the sound after the burning was not quiet mourning. The sound was work, heavy hammers hitting metal. The Babylonians were not there only to wreck. The Babylonians were there to take. The temple had functioned like the nation's central bank, and now the storehouse was open. Nebuzaradan's troops started pulling the place apart piece by piece, an act the Jews would have seen as a violation, but the invaders treated as plain war work. At the entrance stood two huge bronze pillars, Jachin and Boaz. Those pillars were too big to move as single pieces, so the engineers broke them down, turning Solomon's masterpieces into smaller sections the carts could carry. The large washing basins were taken, the bowls were taken, the censers made of pure gold were taken. Everything was counted, bundled, and loaded. The destination was not a display room. The destination was Babylon, where those holy objects would be used at pagan feasts to drink wine in honour of other gods. And the worst theft was not metal, the worst theft was people. Babylon's policy worked like forced brain drain. Babylon did not want extra mouths that could not produce. Babylon sorted the survivors with cold order. Skilled craftsmen were pulled out. Metal workers were pulled out. Intellectuals were pulled out. Strong young men were pulled out. Chains went on, and long lines formed. The purpose was simple: carry the talent to build the enemy empire's strength. Back in Judah, among the smoking remains, the Babylonians left the vine dressers and the poorest farmers, people who had never had real power and who now faced an emptied and ruined land. Then the middle class and the elite of Jerusalem were driven into what became a death march, hundreds of kilometres through the wilderness under the whip, with no promise they would ever see home again. This was the end of national rule, and the start of what is called the Babylonian captivity. Jerusalem was gone, the king was gone, and the temple was gone, and it looked like the end of the road for the Jewish people. Yet when the dust settled on Mount Moriah, the destruction did not vanish without leaving a trace. That year's ashes covered evidence that would stay hidden for thousands of years, waiting for someone to dig and ask what happened. If you go to Jerusalem today and walk down the eastern slope of the city of David, and you start digging, sooner or later a shovel hits a layer that is not normal soil and not solid rock. It is a dark, packed, dirty strip. Archaeologists call that strip the Babylonian destruction layer. The label is not symbolic. It is the actual soot preserved in the ground from the fire Nebuzaradan started 2,600 years ago. Inside that layer, researchers found bronze arrowheads linked to Babylon's army, mixed with burned wood and shattered pottery. The ground holds the moment, as if it was sealed in place. Those ashes are physical evidence that the biblical account is not only theological language, it reads like a report from a crime scene with traces still present. The heat was so severe, it left a mark on the geology itself. But when you lift your eyes toward the Temple Mount, the surface tells a different kind of story. Nothing visible remains of the building Solomon raised, not a single stone sitting in view to explain what stood there. Later building campaigns under Herod, and later Islamic construction, covered or removed the earlier remains. What you see now is absence, and that absence produced the sharp reversal that followed the tragedy. In the ancient world, when a nation's temple fell, people took it as proof that the nation's God had been beaten, and the religion usually died with the building. With the Jews, the reverse happened. Without an altar for animal offerings, the people had to reshape their worship. In exile, the people learned they could speak to the Creator without a structure. Blood sacrifice was replaced by prayer and by the study of sacred texts. Out of that loss, Rabbinic Judaism took shape around the synagogue and the community. A stone sanctuary was gone, but an inner portable temple took its place, something that could not be burned and could travel, and that is what allowed the people to survive long centuries of persecution without disappearing. Nebuchadnezzar thought the nation had been erased, but the result was the opposite. The people became enduring. Fire ate the cedar and the gold, but that same fire strengthened a people who learned to seek God without needing walls.